I was just trying to understand how the ventilation worked. I sat with digital scans, measuring the airflow intake shafts of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. It was supposed to be a boring technical analysis of passive airflow systems in the mid-19th century. But when I overlaid the architectural capacity against the census records to check the population density, the numbers broke. Between 1850 and 1900, while the general population grew steadily, female asylum admissions didn't just rise. They exploded by 500%. I thought it was a math error. I recalculated everything 3 times before I realized the error wasn't in the spreadsheet. The error was in the official history of why we built palaces to lock these women. I did not set out to investigate the end of the world. I was not looking for a lost civilization, and I certainly wasn't looking for evidence of a timeline reset. My initial research was, frankly, boring. It was supposed to be a comparative analysis of institutional architecture in the mid-19th century. I was interested in the Kirkbride plan. If you aren't familiar with it, Thomas Story Kirkbride was a physician in the 1850s who believed that the physical environment could cure mental illness. He designed these massive, sprawling batwing buildings, long, staggered wings, meant to maximize sunlight and airflow. The idea was moral treatment. It was a shift from the dark, prison-like cells of the early 1800s to something that was supposed to be therapeutic. I was looking at blueprints. That was it. I was trying to understand how the ventilation systems worked. I had a stack of digital scans from the Library of Congress, and I was measuring the airflow intake shafts of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia and the Buffalo State Asylum in New York. I wanted to write a script about Victorian engineering, about how they managed to circulate air through buildings that were a quarter-mile long without electricity or modern HVAC systems. It was a technical project. It was safe. It was explainable. But when you study the architecture of an institution, you inevitably have to look at the population it was built to house. You have to look at the numbers. You have to calculate the square footage per patient to understand the density. And that is where the mundane research stopped, and the problem began. I started pulling census data to create a baseline. I needed to know the rate of population growth in the United States between 1850 and 1880 so I could compare it to the rate of asylum construction. The United States population was growing, of course. Immigration, expansion, natural increase, the curve goes up steadily. But when I overlaid the graph of asylum admissions specifically for women, the lines didn't match. They didn't even look like they belonged to the same civilization. Between 1850 and 1900, the general population grew at a predictable, biological rate. But the population of women committed to asylums in urban centers didn't just grow, it exploded. In some districts, the admission rates jumped by 500% in a single decade. I thought I had made a spreadsheet error. I assumed I had missed a decimal point or conflated a county record with a state record. So I deleted the row. I went back to the source. I re-entered the data manually, cell by cell. The result was the same, a 500% increase. I sat back and looked at the screen. In any other field, a spike like that indicates a catastrophe. If you saw a 500% spike in broken legs, you would look for an earthquake or a war. If you saw a 500% spike in respiratory failure, you would look for a plague or a gas leak. But here, the diagnosis was insanity. And it was gender-specific. The male admission rates climbed, yes, but they tracked closer to the stress of industrialization and the trauma of the Civil War. The female rates were decoupling from reality. I tried to explain it away. That is always the first instinct, to protect the worldview you already have. I told myself it was better diagnostics. Maybe doctors were just getting better at identifying mental illness. I told myself it was the stress of urbanization, women moving from farms to cities, the breakdown of the traditional family. It sounded plausible. It sounded like the kind of thing you read in a textbook. But then, I made the mistake of looking at the admission ledgers themselves. I wanted to see the specific medical criteria that justified this explosion. If this was a medical crisis, there should be a medical pattern. I expected to see schizophrenia, dementia, biological deterioration. Instead, I found the catch-all. I found the word that appears thousands of times in the leather-bound intake logs of the era. Hysteria. But it wasn't just the word. It was the causes listed next to it. In the column marked supposed cause of insanity, I didn't find viruses or injuries. I found novel reading. I found suppression of menses. I found grief. I found religious excitement. I found domestic trouble. And most chillingly, I found tendency to cause trouble and independent thought. I remember staring at an entry from the Jacksonville State Hospital, dated 1872. A woman, age 34, cause of insanity. Imaginary female trouble, duration 4 years. This wasn't a medical diagnosis. This was a personality profile. And that's when the architecture I had been studying started to look different. I had been looking at these buildings as hospitals, places of healing, however misguided. But as I looked at the numbers and the reasons for admission, the buildings stopped looking like sanctuaries and started looking like containers. The sheer size of them, these Gothic behemoths built of stone and brick, with walls 2 feet thick and iron bars on the windows, suddenly didn't feel like a charitable effort by the state to care for the sick. It felt like a mobilization. It felt like a purge. I stopped writing the script about ventilation. I stopped caring about the airflow. I needed to know who these women were. I needed to know why a developing nation, struggling to rebuild after a civil war, would spend millions of dollars, billions in today's currency, to lock away a generation of mothers, sisters, and wives. I needed to know why the symptoms of their madness sounded so much like the symptoms of a memory that refused to die. And that is when I started looking at the photographs. If the statistics were the crack in the facade, the photographs were the sledgehammer that broke it wide open. You can argue with numbers. You can interpret them, contextualize them, smooth them over with sociological theories. But you cannot argue with a face that is looking right at you. I began searching for the intake portraits. In the mid to late 19th century, photography was becoming institutionalized. Asylums, prisons, and hospitals began documenting their guests. I focused on 2 specific collections: the archives of the Athens Lunatic Asylum in Ohio and the Willard Asylum for the Chronic Insane in New York. These aren't obscure records. Many have been digitized by universities or state historical societies. They are presented as curiosities, a glimpse into the Gothic past of mental health. I downloaded the high-resolution files. I wanted to see the grain. I wanted to see the emulsion. I wanted to be sure that what I was seeing wasn't a modern artistic project or a digital composite. The images are undeniable. They are wet plate collodion photographs. You can see the characteristic imperfections, the pooling of the chemicals at the edges of the plate, the slight swirling in the dark corners, the incredible depth of field that this process achieved. These are slow exposures. The subject had to sit perfectly still for several seconds. There is no way to fake the specific way light falls on a Victorian woolen dress in a studio lit by northern exposure. I zoomed in. The official narrative tells us that these asylums were built for the indigent insane, the poor, the destitute, the people who had fallen through the cracks of society and had nowhere else to go. We are told these were women who had lost their minds due to the harshness of poverty, malnutrition, and the squalor of the industrial age. But look at the silk. I found a portrait of a woman admitted to the Athens Asylum in 1876. She is seated in a wooden chair. She is labeled Patient 42. But she is wearing a dress that involves yards of complex, heavy brocade. The bodice is fitted with a precision that requires a master tailor. There is lace at her collar, real lace, the kind that is handmade with bobbins, a process that takes hundreds of hours. I checked the grain again. I thought maybe it was a costume. Maybe the asylum dressed them up for the photo. But that doesn't make sense. Why would an institution dedicated to the indigent spend money on high-fashion props? And the dress fits her perfectly. It wasn't pinned in the back. It was made for her body. Then I looked at the jewelry. In several portraits, before the personal effects were stripped away and catalogued, the women are wearing brooches, earrings, and necklaces. I zoomed in on a brooch worn by a woman labeled melancholic. It was a micro-mosaic, a piece of jewelry made from thousands of tiny glass tesserae, arranged to form a picture of the Roman Forum. This is not costume jewelry. This is high-end, old-world craftsmanship. This is the kind of object that belongs to a class of people who travel, who appreciate art, who have lineage. Why was she listed as a pauper? But the most unsettling detail wasn't the clothing. It was the eyes. When you look at medical photography from later eras, or even mugshots of the time, you often see confusion. You see the vacancy of dementia, or the wild, disheveled energy of mania. You see people who are broken. These women are not broken. They are terrified, yes. They are grieving, yes. But they are lucid. They are looking at the camera lens with a specific, penetrating intelligence. They have the posture of queens who have been deposed. They sit with their spines straight, their hands folded in their laps with a practiced elegance that defies the setting. They do not look like patients who have lost their grip on reality. They look like prisoners of war who are refusing to give the interrogator the satisfaction of seeing them cry. There is one photograph from the Trans-Allegheny collection that haunts me. The woman is older, perhaps 50. She has gray streaks in her hair, which is pulled back in a severe, complex bun. She is wearing a dark dress with intricate buttonwork. She is looking slightly to the left of the camera. Her expression isn't blank. It is judgmental. She looks like she is assessing the photographer, finding him wanting, and waiting for this indignity to be over so she can return to her work. What work? I started looking into the suitcase collections. This is a phenomenon where archivists and photographers, most notably the photographer John Crispin, whose work is invaluable, have documented the luggage left behind by patients who died in these institutions. The suitcases were packed by the women themselves before they were taken away. They believed they were going on a trip, or perhaps they knew they were leaving forever and took what mattered most. The contents of these suitcases destroy the indigent narrative completely. I saw silver hairbrushes with monograms. I saw leather-bound books of poetry in French and German. I saw drafting tools. I saw tea sets wrapped in linen. I saw silk shawls that looked like they had been imported from the Orient. These were not the belongings of the mad poor. These were the portable archives of a cultured, educated class. And yet, the records list them as domestics, housewives, or unemployed. The discrepancy is so loud, it creates a ringing in your ears. You are looking at a photo of a woman who looks like she could run a university, wearing clothes that cost more than a farm worker earned in a year, and the caption says, "Hysteria, cause, novel reading." It feels like a glitch in the simulation. It feels like two timelines have been smashed together, the visual evidence of a high civilization population, overlaid with the textual evidence of a primitive, crushing bureaucracy. I spent weeks just staring at these faces. I tried to find the madness. I tried to see what the doctor saw. But the more I looked, the less I saw pathology, and the more I saw trauma. Not the trauma of a broken brain, but the trauma of a broken world. These women looked like they had seen something burn. They looked like they remembered a time before the smoke cleared, and that brought me to the silence. Because if these women were not crazy, if they were, in fact, the keepers of a culture that was being systematically dismantled, then the institutions that held them were not hospitals. They were holding cells, and the doctors were not healers. They were jailers. I turned my attention to the medical literature. I wanted to know how the professional class of the 19th century justified this. How did they explain away the cognitive dissonance of locking up thousands of articulate, educated women? The pattern I found is one I have come to call the three-step dismissal. Acknowledge, categorize, move on. The medical journals of the 1860s and 70s are filled with articles acknowledging the spike in female insanity. They don't deny it happens, they acknowledge it openly. But they immediately categorize it in a way that shuts down inquiry. They frame it as a biological inevitability. They discuss the wandering womb, or the fragility of the female nervous system, in the face of modern excitement. They create a box called hysteria, put everything that doesn't fit the narrative into that box, and then seal the lid. And then they move on. They don't ask why the female nervous system suddenly collapsed in 1855. They don't ask why grief over a lost world would be misdiagnosed as madness. They simply file the anomaly away under medical curiosities. This silence is maintained today. I contacted archives. I looked at modern historical interpretations. The narrative is always the same. It was a dark time for women's rights. Victorian psychiatry was primitive. Men were threatened by female sexuality. All of that is true, but it is also incomplete. It feels like a cover story that has become so repeated that even the people repeating it believe it. It explains the oppression, but it doesn't explain the scale. It doesn't explain the infrastructure. Patriarchy explains why a husband might want to silence a troublesome wife. It doesn't explain why the state would build a 10 million brick fortress to house her, equip it with hydrotherapy systems that required advanced plumbing engineering, and staff it with hundreds of attendants. The incentives for silence were powerful. I found references to the legal status of the insane. Once a woman was committed, she ceased to be a legal person. She could not testify in court. She could not hold title to land. She could not inherit property. Her memory, her testimony about the past, became legally invalid. If you wanted to erase a history, you wouldn't need to kill everyone who remembered it. You would just need to discredit them. You would need to label their memories as delusions. I found a reference to a collection of unmailed letters from the Kalamazoo State Hospital. Thousands of letters written by patients to their families, to lawyers, to the newspapers. They were never posted. They were collected by the staff and stored in boxes, categorized as symptomatic writings. I couldn't read the originals, many are restricted or decayed, but I found summaries and transcripts in obscure academic papers from the 1970s. The researchers treated them as sad examples of schizophrenia. But reading the excerpts, a different pattern emerges. The women weren't writing gibberish. They were writing specific, consistent complaints. They wrote about property that was stolen. They wrote about the fire that took the city. They wrote about a life that existed before the new men came. One fragment, quoted in a dissertation on asylum literature, stopped me cold. A woman named Alara, committed in 1878, wrote, "They tell me the towers never existed. They tell me the water did not glow. But I know the shape of the stones. I drew them before they put me in the dark." The historian called this a classic delusion of grandeur. But what if it wasn't? What if she was describing the built environment as she remembered it? What if she was describing the old world? This professional avoidance creates a vacuum. The historians agree not to ask certain questions. They agree that hysteria was just a social construct. They agree that the delusions were just brain chemistry. They agree to look at the asylum as a social failure rather than a strategic success. They don't ask why the treatments were so specifically designed to break the will. I researched the rest cure and the water cure. The water cure involved wrapping a patient in cold, wet sheets, mummy style, for hours or even days. The official explanation was that the cold water cooled the inflamed nerves. But think about the mechanics of it. You are bound. You are freezing. You are sensory deprived. You cannot move. You cannot speak. It is a technique for inducing compliance. It is torture designed to shatter the ego. Why would you need to shatter the ego of a woman whose only crime was suppression of menses? Unless her ego, her identity, her memory, was the threat. The silence of the archives is loud. It is the silence of thousands of voices screaming into a void, filed away under miscellaneous. It is the silence of a crime so vast that we have mistaken it for the landscape. And speaking of the landscape, I had to go back to the buildings. I had started with the architecture, but I hadn't really seen it. I had been looking at blueprints, at lines on paper. I needed to understand the physical reality of these places. I drove to the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. It stands in Weston, West Virginia, like a mountain made of stone. It is one of the largest hand-cut stone masonry buildings in the Western Hemisphere. It is terrifyingly beautiful, and it is huge. The official story is that construction began in 1858. We are told it was built by prison labor and local stonemasons. We are told it was designed to house 250 patients, but eventually held over 2,000. I stood at the main entrance. The tower looms over you, 200 feet in the air. The walls are sandstone, massive blocks cut with a precision that would require diamond saws or advanced machinery. Yet we are told it was done with chisels and hammers by untrained convicts. I took out my laser measure. I walked into the main corridor. The ceiling soared above me. I measured the width of the hallway, 16 feet. Why do you need a 16-foot wide corridor for a mental hospital? Official answer: airflow. To prevent the miasma of disease. I measured the doorways leading into the wards, 12 feet high, 12 feet. I am 6 feet tall. A 12-foot door makes me feel like a child. It makes me feel insignificant. It is a scale reserved for cathedrals, for palaces, for places where giants, literal or metaphorical, walk. It is not a human scale. It is certainly not a scale for a charitable hospital built on a budget during the Civil War. I walked deeper into the building. I found the medical wings. I found staircases made of solid marble, not wood, not local stone, but marble, in a West Virginia asylum. The wear patterns on the steps were deep, worn down by a century of shuffling feet. But the grandeur was unmistakable. Why put a marble staircase in a wing for the chronic insane? Why put intricate rosette molding on the ceilings of rooms where patients were allegedly screaming and smearing filth on the walls? The aesthetic explanation, that the Victorians just liked pretty things, fails when you look at the functional spaces. I found a utility closet with a 10-foot door. I found a basement storage area with vaulted brick arches that rivaled the crypts of European cathedrals. Grandeur serves a purpose. In a palace, it intimidates and impresses. In a church, it inspires awe. In a hospital for the unwanted, it serves no purpose at all. It is a waste of resources. Unless the grandeur wasn't added for the patients. Unless the grandeur was already there. I started to look at the geographical spread of these buildings. The Kirkbride asylums appear all over the Northeast and Midwest between 1850 and 1890. They all share the same features: massive footprints, Gothic or Romanesque styling, millions of bricks, impossible stone masonry, and advanced ventilation systems. I looked at the Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts. I looked at the Traverse City State Hospital in Michigan. I looked at the Buffalo State Asylum. They are all palaces. The hypothesis began to form in my mind, unbidden. It was a thought I tried to push away because it sounded too radical. But the measurements forced it back. What if they didn't build them? What if the construction photos, which are strangely rare and often show the building already mostly complete with scaffolding just around the spire, were actually restoration photos? What if these buildings were the survivors of the reset? What if they were the palaces, the healing centers, the universities of the previous civilization? And what if the insane women were simply the people who used to live in them? Imagine the psychological warfare of that. You are a survivor of a catastrophe. The world you knew is gone. The new controllers take you, label you crazy, and lock you inside the ruins of your own culture. You are forced to scrub the floors of a ballroom where you once danced. Only now, it is a ward with iron bars on the windows. You are forced to sleep in a dormitory that used to be a library. The building itself becomes the torture device. Every archway, every molding, every marble step is a reminder of what was stolen from you. And every time you point to it and say, "This was ours," the doctor writes down, "Delusions of grandeur." It creates a perfect loop. The evidence of the old world is used to imprison the witnesses of the old world. I checked the ventilation again. The Kirkbride ventilation system is a marvel of passive engineering. It uses heat differentials and underground tunnels to pull fresh air up through the walls and vent stale air out through the towers. It works without pumps. It works without electricity. Modern engineers struggle to replicate it. When these buildings are renovated today, they often have to smash through the walls to install HVAC ducts because they can't figure out how to make the original system work. We are supposed to believe that a society that was still using leeches and mercury to cure disease, a society that hadn't yet invented the light bulb, figured out the fluid dynamics of airflow for a quarter-mile-long structure perfectly on the first try? Or is it more likely that the system was already there, and the architects like Kirkbride were simply the ones who drafted the plans for the bars? I stood in the shadow of the Trans-Allegheny Tower, and I felt a profound sense of dislocation. The scale was wrong. The narrative was wrong. The math was wrong. But if the women were the link to the past, and the buildings were the evidence of the past, then locking them up was only half the solution. You can lock up a generation, but eventually, they die. What do you do with their legacy? What do you do with their children? That was the next question that haunted me. If thousands of women were being pulled out of society and thrown into these stone fortresses, where were their children going? You can't have a reset if the lineage continues. You can't have a new narrative if the grandmother tells the grandson the truth. You have to break the chain. And that is when I started looking for the children. I didn't have to look far. The timeline matches perfectly. The asylum explosion begins in the 1850s, and in 1854, another phenomenon begins. A phenomenon that is taught in every history class as a benevolent charitable movement, but which looks very different when you view it through the lens of erasure. The Orphan Trains. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were transported from the cities of the East Coast to the rural Midwest. We are told they were street urchins, abandoned children, the refuse of the slums. They were put on trains and shipped west, where they were paraded on platforms and chosen by farming families to work in the fields. I looked at the records of the Children's Aid Society. I looked at the intake forms. Many of these children were not orphans. The records often list the parents as living. So why were the children taken? The reasons listed parallel the asylum ledgers. Mother destitute. Mother intemperate. Mother unable to provide. Mother insane. Do you see the mechanism? Step 1. Declare the mother insane. Commit her to the asylum. Step 2. Declare the child a ward of the state. Step 3. Put the child on a train. Step 4. Change the name. That was the part that chilled me the most. The name changes. When the children were adopted out in the Midwest, they often took the names of their new families. Or, if they kept their first names, their surnames were anglicized, simplified, erased. A child named Giovanni becomes John. A child with a complex Old World surname becomes Smith or Miller. The genealogical link is severed. The child grows up on a farm in Nebraska, told that his mother was a crazy woman in New York who didn't want him. He never learns about the brocade dress. He never sees the micro-mosaic jewelry. He never hears the stories about the towers. He works the field, he builds the new world, and he forgets. It is a systematic washing of the population. And to make sure the erasure was permanent, the paper trail had to be destroyed. I started looking for the census records. I wanted to track a family, just one family, from freedom to asylum to orphan train. I wanted to connect the dots. I went to the 1890 U.S. Census. This is the critical decade. This is the peak of the transition. This is the moment when the old world was finally being buried under the new. But you can't look at the 1890 census, because it doesn't exist. We are told that in January 1921, a fire broke out in the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington, D.C. We are told that the 1890 census records, millions of pages of data, were destroyed by fire and water damage. Almost the entire record of the United States population for that pivotal decade is gone. Just gone. We have the 1880 records. We have the 1900 records. But the gap in the middle? The gap where the reset was solidified? It is a black hole. Historians call it a tragedy. Archivists call it a loss. But when you look at it in the context of the asylums, and the trains, and the repurposed architecture, it doesn't look like an accident. It looks like the final act of a cleanup operation. It is the burning of the receipts. Without those records, we cannot track the mass disappearance of the Tartarian lineage. We cannot prove that the woman listed as a housewife in 1880 is the same woman listed as inmate in 1900. The bridge has been burned, but fragments remain. They always miss something. I began digging into state-level directories, city guides, the small, local publications that didn't go to Washington, and I found the subtle shifts. I looked at a directory from a small town in Ohio, dated 1860. I looked at the occupations listed for women. It was surprising. I saw healer. I saw herbalist. I saw entries that were ambiguous, like designer or planner. I looked at the same town's directory for 1885. The titles were gone. The women were listed as widow, domestic, or nothing at all. It wasn't just that the people were disappearing. The categories were disappearing. The language itself was being pruned. The roles that women held in the old world, roles of authority, of healing, of design, were being erased from the lexicon. They were making it impossible to even describe what had been lost. But the maps were where the silence became deafening. I started comparing maps of cities from 1850 to 1890. I looked at the bird's-eye view lithographs that were so popular in that era. You've seen them, the incredibly detailed, hand-drawn aerial perspectives of American cities. In the 1850 maps, you see structures that are labeled with names that don't make sense. Exhibition Hall, Galvanic Center, Botanical Conservatory, massive domed structures with spires. By 1890, those same structures are either gone or they have been renamed. The Galvanic Center is now a municipal warehouse. The conservatory is now an asylum. The buildings remained, but their function was retconned. They were being rewritten in real time. And that's when I started finding the newspaper reports. If the maps were the sanitized official record of the transition, the draft that the controllers wanted us to see, the newspapers were the messy, unfiltered reality of the ground level. I spent weeks in the microfiche archives, scrolling through reels of the New York Tribune, the Cincinnati Enquirer, and small-town gazettes from the 1850s to the 1870s. I was looking for the cracks. I was looking for the moments where the narrative hadn't yet solidified, where the reporters were simply transcribing what they saw without knowing they were documenting a cover-up. You have to understand the tone of journalism in the mid-19th century. It wasn't like today. It was drier, more observational, often brutally matter-of-fact. They didn't sensationalize these stories because to them, they weren't sensations. They were just local news. I found a recurring column type that usually appeared on page 3 or 4. It wasn't headlined Alien Invasion or Time Travel. It was usually titled Police Blotter or Local Occurrences. The pattern is specific. A woman is found wandering. She is often described as disoriented, but well-dressed. She is often found near the burned district or near the old municipal works. And almost invariably, the report notes that she is speaking gibberish, an unknown tongue, or wild fantasies. I found a report from the Cincinnati Enquirer, dated June 1868. It describes a woman arrested for public disturbance near the construction site of the new city hall. The article notes, with a tone of bemused condescension, that the woman, identified only as Mrs. K, insisted that the workmen were destroying the harmony of the stone. She claimed that the building belonged to her father's people and that the new bricks were soft. The reporter wrote, "The poor creature was laboring under the delusion that the ancient foundation was of recent design and that she possessed some title to the civic palace. She was remanded to the custody of the Lunacy Commission." I paused on that phrase. New bricks were soft. It's a specific detail. If you study the Tartarian architectural theory, one of the core tenets is the difference in material quality. The Old World stone and red brick were geopolymer or advanced masonry, hard, conductive, enduring. The Reconstruction brick used in the late 1800s was inferior, porous, and crumbly. Here was a woman in 1868, diagnosed as insane, making a specific materials engineering complaint that aligns exactly with a theory that wouldn't be articulated for another 150 years. Was she crazy? Or was she a quality control inspector for a civilization that had just been fired? I found another account in a Missouri paper from 1859. A woman found walking along the railway tracks that many researchers believe were built on top of older pneumatic transit lines. She was shouting that the hum was gone. The police report stated she was hysterical due to the silence. Think about that. Hysterical due to the silence. If you lived in a world of free energy, of atmospheric electricity, of humming resonators and towers, a world that was alive, and then suddenly the power was cut, the hum stopped, and the world went dead and silent, wouldn't you scream? Wouldn't the silence drive you mad? The medical authorities called it tinnitus, or auditory hallucinations. They treated it with laudanum, but the report says she missed the hum. The frequency of these reports is staggering between 1850 and 1875. It feels like a society trying to process a population of displaced persons. There are hundreds of accounts of wild women who refuse to enter the new wooden houses, who refuse to wear the new coarse fabrics, who refuse to accept the new currency. And then, around 1880, the reports stop. They don't taper off gradually. They drop off a cliff. By 1885, you don't find stories about well-dressed women speaking unknown tongues. You find stories about institutional expansions and new wings opening at the state hospital. The problem had been solved. The containment was complete. The wild women had been processed, categorized, and locked behind the 12-foot doors of the Kirkbride buildings. The newspapers went back to reporting on politics and industrial fairs, and the voices of the dissenters were silenced. The physical evidence of their existence, however, was harder to hide. You can burn a census record. You can stop printing a news story. But it is much harder to destroy thousands of tons of physical artifacts. You have to put them somewhere. And this brings me to the objects. I started visiting antique medical auctions. I started looking at the museum displays in the lobbies of the few asylums that have been preserved. I looked at the tools that were used to treat these women. We are told these were medical devices. We are told they were the product of a primitive but well-meaning science. But when you examine them, when you touch the cold iron and the heavy wood, they don't feel like medicine. They feel like corrections. Take the Utica crib. I examined one in a museum in New York. It is a wooden cage, about the size of a coffin, with slatted sides and a hinged top. An adult human is placed inside, and the lid is locked. The patient cannot sit up. They can barely turn over. They are forced to lie flat, looking through the slats at the ceiling. The official use: to calm violent patients and prevent them from harming themselves. But look at the wear patterns. I ran my hand along the inside of the slats. The wood was gouged. It was worn smooth in places, but deep, frantic scratches marred the grain in others. These were the marks of fingernails, the marks of rings being dragged against oak. Why would you need to cage a woman whose diagnosis was grief? The Utica crib wasn't about safety. It was about containment. It was about physically restricting the movement of someone who refused to sit still. It is the kind of device you use to break an animal. Then, there is the spinning chair. This device looks like something from the Inquisition. A chair suspended from a ceiling mount or on a pivot, designed to spin the patient at high speeds until they lost consciousness or vomited. The medical theory was that it rearranged the fluids in the brain. But consider the alternative interpretation. If you are dealing with a population that remembers a different reality, a population that is grounded in a specific history, how do you unmoor them? You disorient them. You induce vertigo. You physically scramble their sensory input until they can no longer trust their own balance, their own perception of up and down. You spin them until the world they remember dissolves into a blur, and when they wake up, they are too sick to argue. But the most damning artifacts are the tubs. The hydrotherapy rooms of the Kirkbride asylums are marvels of plumbing. I visited a preserved ward in West Virginia where the tubs were still in place. These are not standard bathtubs. They are massive, cast iron and porcelain vessels, often 6 feet long and incredibly deep. They are fitted with canvas covers that strap across the top, leaving only the head exposed. The plumbing fixtures attached to them are industrial. Large copper pipes, temperature gauges, continuous flow valves. I measured the flow rate capacity. These systems were designed to keep water moving, to maintain a specific temperature for hours, days, even weeks. The water cure involves submerging a woman in this tub, strapping the canvas down, and leaving her there. Sometimes for an hour, sometimes for days. Why? The doctor said it cooled the blood. But anyone who has studied interrogation techniques knows what this is. It is sensory deprivation combined with physical restraint. It is a technique designed to induce a state of regression. When you are suspended in water, unable to move, unable to see your own body, you lose your sense of self. Your ego boundaries dissolve. You become pliable. You become suggestible. If you wanted to reprogram a human being, if you wanted to wash away their identity and replace it with a new one, this is exactly how you would do it. You would put them in the tub until they forgot their name. You would put them in the tub until they forgot the old world. And when they weren't in the tubs, what were they doing? They were working. This is the detail that the indigent narrative cannot explain. The asylum records are full of inventories of goods produced by the patients. In the female wards, this was almost exclusively textile work. But it wasn't just mending sheets. I found photographs of the sewing rooms. Rows of women, heads bent, working with complex lace-making pillows, embroidery hoops, and weaving looms. The output of these rooms was staggering. They produced intricate lace, fine embroidery, tapestries, and tailored garments. Here is the question. If these women were paupers and farm wives who had lost their minds, where did they learn these skills? Lace making, specifically the kind of bobbin lace seen in the asylum outputs, is a master craft. It takes years to learn. It requires mathematical precision. It requires a level of dexterity and focus that is incompatible with the diagnosis of mania or dementia. You cannot take a crazy farm girl and teach her to make chantilly lace in a week. These women already knew how to do it. They were the artisans. They were the guild masters. They were the textile engineers of the previous era. And the therapy of the asylum was actually a forced labor camp. The controllers didn't just want to silence them. They wanted to extract their value. They locked up the masters and forced them to produce luxury goods for the new elite, the very people who had stolen their world. I held a piece of asylum-made lace in an antique shop in Pennsylvania. It was tagged, "Lunatic Lace, circa 1880. The pattern was recursive, geometric, almost fractal. It didn't look like flowers. It looked like a schematic. It looked like the floor plan of a cathedral. I realized then that they weren't just making doilies. They were weaving their memory into the only medium they were allowed to touch. They were encoding the geometry of the old world into the fabric of the new. And once you see that, once you see the architecture, the erasure, the torture devices, and the skills, the official story collapses. It dissolves like wet paper, and something else takes its place. A hypothesis that is terrifying, but coherent. The hypothesis. What if hysteria was never a disease? What if hysteria was the clinical diagnosis for the trauma of the reset? Let us assume, for a moment, the Tartarian timeline. Let us assume that in the mid-19th century, a catastrophe occurred. A mud flood, a directed energy weapon, a frequency shift. The mechanism matters less than the result. The result was the end of a high-tech, aesthetically advanced global civilization. The cities remained. The infrastructure remained. But the population was decimated. The survivors were traumatized. The men, perhaps the soldiers, perhaps the workers, were largely gone, or they were conscripted immediately into the reconstruction efforts, sent to dig out the railways and repave the streets. They were broken by labor, but the women remembered. They remembered the free energy. They remembered the healing frequencies. They remembered a life of abundance and beauty. And they refused to accept the new narrative of scarcity, coal smoke, and debt. The controllers, the group that inherited or usurped the empty cities, faced a problem. They needed to reboot civilization. They needed to create a new history, one where humanity was a struggling, primitive species, slowly clawing its way up from the mud. They couldn't have thousands of matriarchs walking around saying, "No, we didn't build this with horse carts. We sang it into existence." They couldn't kill them all. That would be inefficient, and perhaps the population was already too low. So they pathologized the memory. They created a medical framework where insisting on the past was a symptom of insanity. You say there were towers that glowed? That is a hallucination. Diagnosis, hysteria. You say you don't belong in this mud-filled street. That is a delusion of grandeur. Diagnosis, hysteria. You refuse to marry a stranger and birth children for the state? That is suppression of natural duty. Diagnosis, hysteria. They took the surviving palaces, the star forts, the healing centers, the universities, and they put bars on the windows. They rebranded them as asylums for the insane. They marched the women in. They stripped them of their brocade and micro-mosaics. They put them in the tubs to wash away the memories. They put them in the cribs to break their defiance. And then they took the children. They put the children on the orphan trains, changed their names, and sent them to the empty farms of the Midwest to be raised as Americans. To be raised with no memory of the towers, no memory of the lace, no memory of the hum. This hypothesis explains the anomalies that the official story cannot touch. It explains the architecture. We didn't build the asylums, we conquered them. That's why they look like castles. That's why the doors are 12 feet high. It explains the census fire. You had to burn the bridge between the old names and the new names. It explains the explosion in admissions. It wasn't an epidemic of madness. It was a mass incarceration of dissidents. It explains the artifacts. The skill level of the inmates wasn't a fluke. It was the residue of the previous civilization. Now, I know the counter-arguments. I have wrestled with them myself. The most common one is the biological explanation. It was syphilis. It was lead poisoning from the water pipes. It was the corsets cutting off oxygen. I checked the syphilis rates. They were high, yes. But syphilis causes physical deterioration, tabes dorsalis, difficulty walking, eventual dementia. It does not cause articulate, philosophical objections to the New World Order. It does not cause a woman to pack a suitcase with drafting tools and poetry. And lead poisoning affects the poor and the rich alike. Yet the Hysteria diagnosis was weaponized specifically against women who had independent thought. The biological explanation is a convenient shield, but it doesn't account for the specific content of the so-called madness. The second strong counterargument is the sociological one. It was just the patriarchy. They say men simply wanted to control women, so they locked them up. This is the comfortable answer for modern historians, because it fits our current political lens. And it is partially true. Control was the goal. But simple patriarchal oppression is usually about exploitation in the home. It's about keeping a woman in the kitchen, not in a castle. The cost of the asylum system was astronomical. The state governments of the 19th century were notoriously cheap. They didn't spend money on social welfare, yet they spent millions on these buildings. They practically bankrupted counties to build them. You don't spend that kind of money just to oppress your wife. You spend that kind of money to contain a threat. The patriarchy argument fails to explain the urgency and the scale. It implies a banality that doesn't match the grandeur of the prisons. The reset hypothesis is the only one that integrates all the data points. It connects the buildings, the trains, the photos, and the silence into a single, cohesive, terrifying picture. But even with this hypothesis, there are things I cannot answer. I cannot tell you exactly what the catastrophe was. The erasure was too complete. Was it a war? A natural cycle? A weapon? The women might have known, but their letters were burned. I cannot tell you who the controllers were. Were they a rival faction, an external force, or just the opportunists who crawled out of the rubble first? And I cannot tell you what happened to the genetics. Did the old world people have different DNA? The size of the doorways and the sheer physical presence of the women in the photos suggests they might have been physically different. Larger, stronger, more robust. Did that lineage get diluted into the general population, or was it stamped out completely? These questions hang in the air like smoke. I reached the end of my investigation, but I did not find closure. I found only a heavier burden. I look at the world differently now. When I drive past an old, brick municipal building with arched windows and a tower that serves no purpose, I don't see a quaint piece of history. I see a crime scene. I see a building that was repurposed. I see a fortress that was used to break the minds of the... I was just trying to understand how the ventilation worked. I sat with digital scans, measuring the airflow intake shafts of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. It was supposed to be a boring technical analysis of passive airflow systems in the mid-19th century. But when I overlaid the architectural capacity against the census records to check the population density, the numbers broke. Between 1850 and 1900, while the general population grew steadily, female asylum admissions didn't just rise. They exploded by 500%. I thought it was a math error. I recalculated everything 3 times before I realized the error wasn't in the spreadsheet. The error was in the official history of why we built palaces to lock these women. I did not set out to investigate the end of the world. I was not looking for a lost civilization, and I certainly wasn't looking for evidence of a timeline reset. My initial research was, frankly, boring. It was supposed to be a comparative analysis of institutional architecture in the mid-19th century. I was interested in the Kirkbride plan. If you aren't familiar with it, Thomas Story Kirkbride was a physician in the 1850s who believed that the physical environment could cure mental illness. He designed these massive, sprawling batwing buildings, long, staggered wings, meant to maximize sunlight and airflow. The idea was moral treatment. It was a shift from the dark, prison-like cells of the early 1800s to something that was supposed to be therapeutic. I was looking at blueprints. That was it. I was trying to understand how the ventilation systems worked. I had a stack of digital scans from the Library of Congress, and I was measuring the airflow intake shafts of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia and the Buffalo State Asylum in New York. I wanted to write a script about Victorian engineering, about how they managed to circulate air through buildings that were a quarter-mile long without electricity or modern HVAC systems. It was a technical project. It was safe. It was explainable. But when you study the architecture of an institution, you inevitably have to look at the population it was built to house. You have to look at the numbers. You have to calculate the square footage per patient to understand the density. And that is where the mundane research stopped, and the problem began. I started pulling census data to create a baseline. I needed to know the rate of population growth in the United States between 1850 and 1880 so I could compare it to the rate of asylum construction. The United States population was growing, of course. Immigration, expansion, natural increase. The curve goes up steadily.